IDC Radio, 106.2 FM. IDC Radio, in collaboration with כל ישראל.
Terrorism's global impact. Highlights from the ICT's 11th International Conference. With Edan Landau.
Good afternoon and welcome to the IDC Radio on 106.2 FM and 106.2 FM COIL on the Internet. We're here for a special broadcast from the 11th World Summit on Counter-Terrorism held by the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism. I'm Edan Landau and I'm here with Professor William C. Banks. Professor Banks, you're the Director of the Institute for National Security and Counter-Terrorism, Syracuse University in the United States.
That's correct. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. You just had a workshop on the new battlefields, old laws, the scope of the 21st century battlefield with forecasting the legal and policy landscape. Could you give us any of the highlights that you discussed during the workshop?
I'd be happy to. For 5 years now, we've been working on a joint project with ICT here at the Interdisciplinary Center and our institute at Syracuse that we call New Battlefields, Old Laws. The title is pretty revealing of its content. That is, our position is that in the modern era of asymmetric warfare, where non-state actors wage war against states, that the traditional framework for regulating those wars is not well suited to manage the conflicts that don't involve traditional soldiers on traditional battlefields. The idea for the project really came during the 2006 Lebanon War. I, with Boaz Gnor here at IDC and a few others, began to think about the need for a project that would consider adaptations in the way that we regulate armed conflict. So now, for 5 years, I believe this is the 5th year here in Herzliya, we've held workshops that explore different dimensions of what we call the new battlefields. We've been quite successful in the workshops. The first book, as a result of our workshop efforts, will be published by Columbia University Press in New York City next month. And we have a second book now in the process of approval at a different university press that we expect to have out next year. Today's workshop was looking at the particular question of the scope of the battlefield. How do 21st century battlefields differ from those of the World War era or even of the Cold War period? We looked at questions such as whether organized crime syndicates and their narco trafficking, for example, could qualify as a battlefield activity, whether a state may use warlike responses to them. We looked at technical issues such as the capacity of autonomous weapon systems to operate without human intervention. We also looked to some degree at the extent to which cyber and other modern technical capabilities in warfare could sort of stretch the dimensions of what we think of as a conventional battlefield.
Okay. When viewing the last decade of counterterrorism in retrospect to the 9/11 events, in a legal point of view, what has changed? I mean, have we made any gain? Have the laws remained the same?
It's I'd say a mixed bag. In some respects, things are very much as they were 10 years ago in the international law community. There are not new treaties, new conventions that respond to the kind of al-Qaeda violence that was so heavily perpetrated on 9/11 and has been since. On the other hand, I believe that many nation states, including Israel and the United States, have made great strides in bringing their legal programs up to the contemporary operational environment. In some ways, you could say that the needs of the battlefield, the needs of the operational forces on the ground have helped to drive the legal regulation framework forward.
What are the obstacles in changing the laws?
Inertia. Many of the traditional laws of war are from the post-World War Geneva Convention era, 1949. it took a tremendous calamity, the horror of World War II, to drive the nations of the world together for that kind of framework building enterprise. It was in the same era, of course, that the United Nations was created. Unfortunately, the divisions in the world since the Cold War and then the post-Cold War rise of non-state-sponsored terrorism have not given rise to the same kind of international consensus about the need for dramatic change. So the status quo is very difficult to affect.
I see. With many terrorist organizations establishing political wings like Hezbollah and Hamas, how do you see the next 5 years of counterterrorism efforts in that regards with coping with those organizations?
There is a real difference, I think, in countering terrorism in regard to groups that have some kind of a claim on territory or a claim of political legitimacy. Indeed, here in the Middle East, you face that situation uniquely with Hamas in particular, but with Hezbollah as well. Al-Qaeda, of course, is no such claim, never has, never will, nor have many of the other active sort of splinter or variant Al-Qaeda groups around the world. So I think the situation here in the Middle East is somewhat unique. There was a similar movement, of course, in Sri Lanka with the Tamils. That conflict was ended, at least for the time being, by the government in the last couple of years. So it's possible for those groups that have a claim to political legitimacy or to territory that you can treat them more like a nation state, and you can wage war and make peace on those terms. It's much more difficult to do that with the traditional non-state enemy.
Well, hypothetically speaking, if Al-Qaeda sees, for example, that it's losing the battle and that the only way to actually gain some way grounds, when they look at other models that have been used by other organizations, and they do establish a political wing, do you think the West will be open to negotiate with them?
It's hard to imagine in the case of Al-Qaeda. I suppose the more realistic variant is the Taliban. And some would say that that kind of a negotiation is ongoing now. Just as Hamas or Hezbollah have various wings or gradations of violence or tendencies toward terrorism, so might the Taliban, and there may well be some segment, some sect within the Taliban that would be amenable to a reasonable negotiation. Negotiation, of course, is only a valuable tool if it can produce results that can be verified and enforced, and time will tell whether that's a credible possibility in this case.
If we shift now more to the active form of counterterrorism, we've seen an increase of use in drones in different theaters of jihad, as well as by other countries such as Israel and Turkey. With the increased involvement of human rights organizations and advocates, including UN institutions, how do you think it will affect these operations?
I think the drone use is a very cutting-edge and difficult problem. I think from the perspective of the United States in countering terrorism, the drone has been perhaps the most effective weapon yet invented. It's been so effective, as we all know, in reducing the threat of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. At the same time, I think there are many of us in the U.S. who are worried about the regulation of the use of drones going forward, not so much from the United States use, but from others who may possess them. Soon, as you know, drones will be on the market. You'll be able to pick up a drone with a weapon in the same way that today we could buy an Uzi or another submachine gun. If you have the money, you can buy the weapon. So I think it's incumbent upon nation states and the international community to adopt a regulatory scheme that will try to assure the lawful use of those weapons only in authorized cases when there is an ongoing counterterrorism campaign.
I know this is a bit of a more outside-of-the-box kind of question, but do you see any change in the use of weapons, and what would be the next weapon of choice against insurgents after the drone? Because at some point it will lose its effectiveness.
You're doubtless correct. I think that there are two schools of thought here that are frequently discussed. One is to look at even newer forms of technology, weapons without human interface, sort of like the drone in the sense that you can manage them remotely and not put a pilot at risk. There are many other kinds of autonomous weapon systems that could be brought to bear, whether they be lasers or various forms of electronic warfare. The other is to think of non-kinetic, non-physically harmful means, cyber weapons, to use a cyber intrusion as a way, for example, to curtail electric power to a given area as a means of letting them be on notice that their state behavior is causing a threat to the one who uses the cyber weapon. And in some respects, it's a more humane form of warfare because cyber war can be waged without direct physical harm to people and may have a political impact as grave or significant as a traditional gun.
How do you view the war on terrorism now that bin Laden has been killed?
It's certainly a new chapter. I think that many experts believe that Al-Qaeda's days are numbered as an active terrorist organization. I think, as some here at the conference in Herzliya have said repeatedly, I agree with these assessments, that terrorism is becoming a more diffuse threat now. There are more splinter groups, more lone wolves, more groups without attribution who may not need to invoke the name Al-Qaeda to justify their existence. So in a way, I think the threat is just as serious but more difficult to quantify and to counter because it will be more difficult to identify the source.
Do you think the U.S. will focus now on other terrorist entities now that there seems to be a decline in the activity of Al-Qaeda?
I think there will be a greater attention. I think there's still considerable energy being given toward eradicating Al-Qaeda for all practical purposes. I think we are more concerned than ever in the United States with so-called homegrown terrorists. That's our problem. And more effort being made in our intelligence and law enforcement communities to prevent acts that could occur inside the United States. And I expect that to continue for a good long time.
One of the purposes of the World Summit on Terrorism is increased cooperation between the different actors in the field. How do you see the next 5 years of cooperation?
Well, I think that's one of the pieces of very good news. I think one of the side effects of 9/11 was to bring many nations' counterterrorism strategies and capabilities together. I think there's more intelligence sharing, even tactical and strategic planning sharing going on between allied governments than ever before. I think we've learned to work with each other, to share command. I think we've done better at sharing intelligence resources and technologies, and in that respect, I think we're much safer than we were 10 years ago.
Do you think that the Arab Spring is actually going to affect that cooperation, since a lot of the information did come out of the more supportive regimes that are now gone?
That's a good question, and the answer isn't clear yet. There's a danger that could have a negative effect, although it may be equally possible that it will simply strengthen our ability to share resources, information, intelligence as new democratic governments, or at least non-totalitarian regimes, non-terrorist support regimes come forward.
Well, Professor Banks, thank you very much for joining us here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much.
הרדיו הבינתחומי 106.2 FM הרדיו החינוכי של המרכז הבינתחומי לכל ישראל 106.2 FM